All right. We're going to get us going. So thank you all for coming. I know it takes a little bit of a time to find your way up here, and so people have come in at various stages. I'll redo a quick, brief intro of me just so people have context. I'm Zach. I'm Open Philanthropy's Chief of Staff. I was asked to do a session related to management skills of some sort. And when we were doing some brainstorming on what we thought might be of interest to an EA audience in particular, feedback immediately came up as something that a number of folks were interested in. And I think there are a lot of cultural reasons, as well as reasons around just getting the right answers that we want, why that is something that many EAs have a particular interest in. This is kind of going to be broken up into a couple of different parts. Towards the beginning of the session, you're going to hear a little bit more of Zach talking and giving some advice or tips. You should feel free to raise your hand and ask questions along the way. Depending on how many there are, I may or may not ask us to move things along, and we can go back towards them at the end. But I'm also going to try and save a chunk of time at the end so we can try and practice and implement and do a little bit of role playing with some feedback skills that we'll go over ahead of time. One other particular note is, as I mentioned and as Patrick mentioned earlier, a lot of this is, the sort of initial frame for this was around management, and there will be a frame around, you'll hear me talk about managers or people who have leadership roles in organizations when talking about this. It isn't exclusively, these skills are not exclusively useful for managers. I think upwards feedback, sideways feedback is something very useful. We're also going to talk about not just giving feedback, but receiving feedback, and so, which is a skill that I think is sometimes underrated here. So just to give us a brief roadmap of where we're going, is we're going to talk about why we care about feedback to begin with. I think many of those reasons are going to be obvious, but also what some of the pitfalls of emphasizing feedback too much can be, and why sometimes we should be cautious about treating feedback as a cure-all. We're going to talk about institutionalizing it, making it a part of our culture, making it something that is embedded within our organizations more deeply. And then towards the end, we're going to do tips to both give feedback and receive feedback and do a little bit of that practice. So why do we care about feedback? I think for many of us, as we went around and shared some of that feedback, hopefully for many of us that represented a moment of growth, a moment of learning, something that was impactful to us in our careers. For many of us, we may have the opportunity to do that for other people as well, and we also could hope to get more of that that can be helpful for us in our growth paths. At the same time, I think that many of these are going to be decently obvious, and I don't want to spend too much time here. There's trying to improve results, there's trying to create a culture of openness and making sure that we're all on the same side, trying to get the right answer as opposed to deferring to somebody in power or deferring to somebody else, just because that's the default way things are done. Making sure that our employees are engaged and bought into the work we're doing, not just by them giving us feedback and making sure that we're doing what we can to support them, but by also giving them those professional development and growth opportunities that they feel like are important to being able to move on. There's positive reinforcement. One of the things we're going to be talking a lot about is positive feedback instead of just the critical side of feedback, and making sure that we're getting more of what we want in addition to setting aside some of the things we may not want as much. There's just making sure we're on the same page. Part of feedback isn't just going and correcting behavior sometimes. Sometimes it's understanding why and entering into it with a curiosity mindset and figuring out, if there are problems, what happened here, and trying to sort of deconstruct that and making sure that we also have a clear set of expectations going forward on what good looks like. There's assessing performance. Sometimes, we get into situations where even with feedback, things aren't working, but we need to make sure we're clear with staff about what performance standards are, which can also lead us to reduced surprises, and just making sure that, again, everybody has an understanding of, all right, this may have been good enough at another org, good enough in another role, or good enough in another job, but these are the clear standards that I'm expecting of you here. These are a lot of things, and I think many of these aren't going to be super surprising to folks, but the thing I want to point out is that they are different goals and that they require different tactics here, and there isn't just one kind of feedback, and there isn't just one set of skills here. And we're going to talk about a variety of different approaches and a variety of different tools you can have in your toolkit, but part of what I want to emphasize are these are tools. It isn't going to be one size fits all. You need to think about the situations you're in, you need to think about the culture you're in, and you need to have a willingness to adapt depending upon what your particular goals are in any given situation. With that being said, one other thing I want to point out is that feedback is not a cure-all. Feedback is not going to be your solution for every problem you face as an organization or every performance issue that you encounter. And we have people who can be great and have amazing skills here. And my cheesy example I have up here is, Serena Williams, one of the greatest tennis players of all times, Will McCaskill, a philosopher who many of you have probably heard of before. They are probably both excellent within their domains of expertise. If I were going to try and find the world's best philosophers, I do not know that I would go to the Williams sisters and try and coach them and just give them lots of feedback and hope that happens. If I were trying to find the world's best tennis players, I am sure that Will has many, many strengths, but I do not know that that is his comparative advantage in the world. I'm not going to go and just feedback my way into excellence or success here. And when you're thinking about what it means to be a leader in an organization, to be a manager, a lot of the returns you're going to get are getting the right people and the right roles. And that means that sometimes you're going to have to make hard decisions. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be giving feedback, but it does mean you should be asking yourself, how likely is it that I think this feedback is going to move the needle? How likely is it that this feedback is going to get me the results and the impact I need for my organization to be successful? And don't just do these feedback tools. You should do them, to be clear. But don't view this presentation as the thing that's going to fix all of the problems that your organization encounters. You are sometimes just going to need to say, hey, maybe this person isn't the right fit for this organization. Maybe this person could be a right fit for this organization, but we need to change the role around. And those are choices that you will encounter as well. And just a few tips around that are basically just ask yourself, if you've been giving these lessons a lot of times, like, are there signs they're learning or are there signs they aren't? And the more opportunities they've had to learn, whether it's in the role at your organization or in similar roles at other orgs, the more similar feedback you've gotten before and the fewer signs of progress or success you've gotten, those might be warning signs that you don't have the right fit for the right person in the right roles. And in those cases, you might want to pause and reassess your approach here and recognize that the tools in your feedback toolkit may not be the right approach for these problems. Part of what I also want to note here is that means that you're going to need to address it to different populations. And so, for example, I spend a lot more time investing in very tactical feedback with people who are straight out of undergrad, for example. And when they've never written a professional email before, I'm going to go through and I'm going to go and rewrite like all of their emails many times and be like, here is a lot of micro-level feedback. I expect something different of somebody who's been in a professional setting for 2 decades. That being said, even some of those people I will give a lot of feedback to, depending on the role. So at Open Philanthropy, one of my jobs right now is I manage a lot of people who lead grant-making portfolios. And most of them are hired for their deep expertise in a field like air quality, but they don't necessarily have grant-making expertise. And so I do expect them to come to the table with a lot of expertise around the air quality side of things, but I'm not going to necessarily expect them to come to the table with a lot of expertise around grant-making. And so I'm then going to be a lot more willing to be patient and give feedback on those new areas in a way that I might not be if I thought they had had a lot of opportunities to learn and grow there. And so, again, a lot of that you'll find by just giving feedback and by starting with these tools with your staff, but you should also be willing to recognize when there's a time to step back. So after doing some of that level setting, we're going to talk about creating a culture of feedback and then giving and receiving feedback well. A sort of rough, imperfect frame you might want to think about with this is, in this next section around creating a culture of feedback, you could sort of think about it as quantity of feedback, making sure there are mechanisms to actually have feedback occurring in your organization in a healthy way. And then we'll get into more of the quality side of things on a more tactical level with some of the giving and receiving. So a lot of this is cultural and being a leader in your organization and being a role model, and figure out the ways in which you can communicate to other staff that feedback is valuable, and also that it's not scary, and that it's something that we should all be appreciating. And so one of the tools I've seen and I've loved with this is showing what happens when you've gotten feedback yourself. During one of our recent all-hands staff meetings at Open Philanthropy, one of our co-CEOs and a director of operation put some feedback they had received on a slide and put it in front of the entire organization and said, here's what some of our guidance was before. Here's why it was a mistake. We received some feedback on that. Here's what we're going how we're going to change our communications going forward. Thank you so much for that. I think we're better off as an organization as a result. And that's the kind of way that makes people realize, oh, like I wasn't wasting my time here. Oh, it doesn't have to be scary. Oh, it can be appreciated. And being explicit about that, even if you know that, if you aren't vocalizing it to staff, they may not realize that either. You should also train your managers on how to do it well, and don't just assume that this is something that is going to come naturally to a lot of people or is going to be implicitly communicated. Make sure that this is an explicit standard that you have across the organization, that feedback is something you care about. We'll get in particular into positive feedback, but I think that's a huge part, making sure that feedback isn't always something that is punishing or scary or hard to deal with, that there's a positive side of well. And lastly, just say thank you, and talk about why it was impactful for you, if it was. Be honest about these things. And I think that could go a long way, again, to making people feel like their time was well spent. But I want to spend some time in particular talking about positive feedback, because when I talk to people at EA orgs, when I've seen my own experience at Open Philanthropy, I know that I think there's a lot of emphasis put on progress and put on getting better and put on constructive feedback. But I also think that sometimes, not intentionally, we forget a little bit in some of the intensity of our cultures about the positive side of things. There was a phenomenon known at Open Phil around Google Docs, where people would go through and they would write a lot of Google Doc comments all the way through and just point out everything. They would read the Google Doc and be like, oh, I disagree with this. Oh, I think this can be fixed. Oh, I think this is wrong, and then put it aside. And then the person who wrote the Google Doc would be, crushed afterwards and be like, oh, I did such a terrible job. And they would talk to people afterwards and be like, thanks so much for the feedback. I know I did I didn't do a really good job on that. It was hard. And they would be like, what are you talking about? Like, that was great. I thought it was fantastic. And people would be like, what are you talking about? I just got, pages and pages of critical feedback here. And people don't oftentimes realize how they're doing or performing, particularly your high performers, if you aren't giving them some of that positive reinforcement as well. And many of you have probably seen some of the EA forum posts or heard discussions around imposter syndrome in EA communities. And I think one of the challenges that we oftentimes face is we don't do a great job telling people what they're doing well, right? We have a lot of struggles. We have a lot of hardship. Like that, many of us are in growing organizations. EA is a young field. Like there will be problems. There will be challenges. But making sure we have some time to recognize people when they're doing well is also very important. And so just a few tips on this. One is just explicitly set aside time for it. You can do things like create prompts for it in your agendas when you're meeting with somebody who you're reporting to, or also do it for your managers. Turns out managers also love positive feedback and positive reinforcement on things, and it's not just a one-way thing. One example of this that I've started using with some of my direct reports are these frameworks that some of you may have heard of called 2x2s, where it's this idea of share with somebody who reports to me 2 pieces of critical feedback and 2 pieces of positive feedback, and they do the same for me. And they don't have to be the biggest pieces of feedback. They don't have to be summative of the overall performance. But it's a way of jump-starting conversations and forcing us and prompting us to make sure we're thinking about what actually has this person done that I've appreciated that I may not have had the opportunity to express lately. Another one is just doing a little bit of a check for balance. Anytime you're engaging in lots of feedback, again, the sort of Google Doc comments is a great time for that. But if you've been doing a lot of it, just step back and think about it. And sometimes when I'm doing that, I've realized I actually just go through and do a second pass on a Google Doc if I've given a lot of feedback and just explicitly mention all of the things that I liked about it to make sure I can reinforce that as well. Follow up. And this is a way of turning some of the constructive criticism into positive criticism. But when somebody has done something and it hasn't gone particularly well, and you let them know that, if they are making improvements there, reinforce that. Say thank you. Go over your way. Even sometimes, particularly, even if this isn't all the way to where you would want it to be and it's small, still express gratitude for the effort and the change and the thought they've put into being able to improve, and encourage them to do even more of that. Recognize the progress that they've done. And lastly, another thought just from the cultural lens of this is doing this more in public. Oftentimes with some of our more critical feedback, we're going to want to do that in private settings so people don't feel as defensive or attacked. I think that public praise is oftentimes a powerful tool, creating buy-in, building relationships, again, building a culture where people realize it's valued. We have a Slack channel called Props at Open Philanthropy where people will just post nice things that they have noticed other people doing. I will sometimes CC managers of people when they've done something like a big project and it's gone really well and be like, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I really appreciated this. I want to let your manager know. Thank you so much. I know it took a ton of time, had this great impact. And so yeah, figuring out how you can make this something that isn't just about the person, it's about the culture overall. That being said, we've talked a lot about culture. I also want to make sure that it isn't just something that is implicit and that you should be thinking about what are different ways of systematizing and formalizing feedback at your organizations, because oftentimes I'm sure many of us have been in trainings or practices before where we've learned something, we've worked really hard at a skill, we get a little bit better at it. The next week, we implemented some. The next week, we implemented maybe a little bit less. And then over time, we slowly just start to forget about those things until it becomes a problem again. And then we're like, oh. And so part of what I want to do and provide here is just sort of like a menu of ideas or options. These aren't all going to be right for every organization. And these don't need to be, you don't need to do all of these at the same time. But some thoughts on how you can formalize feedback systems. There are employee engagement surveys. You can make anonymous forms. So we have surveys that go out a couple of times per year. We also have just like standing forums where if people don't feel comfortable talking to their manager or something, ideally they have those good relationships with their managers to be able to talk about it. But there are also ways to get more anonymous feedback or to the org as a whole, particularly in case something feels scary or weighty. Putting those recurring reminders on your agendas when you're checking in with one of your direct reports. Mentorship programs. We've actually used mentors as a way to collect feedback about the organization as a whole. Just have mentors, like coach our mentors to explicitly ask their mentees, like, hey, do you have any feedback that you want to share with me about open philanthropy? And then they can relay that to others in the org. Start, stop, continue is just another framework, kind of like the 2x2s that I mentioned before, about what's something I should start doing that I'm not doing, what's something I should stop doing that I am doing, what's something I should continue doing that is going well. Just to, again, also try and get different kinds of feedback types out there. The last thing I would just say is customization. Different people are, we'll talk about trying to solicit feedback from people, but the reality is that different people are going to have different thresholds and different levels of buy-in and different levels of trust on giving feedback to others, and creating different formats, and also for different kinds of feedback can be a powerful tool to try and collect more and make sure you don't have blind spots. Some of that can be tailored to the individual, so asking for preferences. When do you want your feedback? And we'll talk about asking for consent and buy-in before giving feedback later on. What kind of feedback do you want? How do you want it? I've done some of those 2x2s with one of my direct reports, and they gave me some feedback at one point that I started with the positive side of things, and then I went to the critical side of things. So like, actually, can you just reverse that for me? Like, it lets me end on a happy note here. And I was like, oh, that's a great piece of feedback. I can do that easily. And so tailoring it to the person, because different people are going to have different preferences there. The multiple points of contact, as I mentioned before, things like mentors and whatnot can be helpful, and also just experimenting. Treat these as tools, use them, put them aside if they aren't working, and figure out what's going to be right for your organization and the particular staff members you have. That being said, last set of tips in this section, in case you're still not getting the feedback that you want after all of this. There are going to be some people, many of us has probably encountered them before, who are going to be a little bit more cautious and a little bit more wary of sharing feedback. They might feel like it could be something threatened or they could be punished for it. And I just want to share a few tips to see, here are some other ways of eliciting feedback from people. And so one of them is just make sure you're actually asking for it very explicitly. I think sometimes people think like, why doesn't this person give me feedback? They know I value it. Do they know you value it? And have you asked them in particular for it as opposed to making general statements of value? So just do that basic check first. But then you can also give them specific prompts. And so, for example, if there's a specific task that's about to happen or one that has happened, you can ask them to watch that, give you feedback on something more tactical. Give them a sense of what the stakes are for you or for them. You can be a better manager or a better partner to them if they give you some more feedback on how you've been performing. You can also lower the bar and just be like you don't need to give me huge life-changing feedback. Not everything needs to be that piece of feedback that you shared at the beginning about something that's been transformative to your career, right? And then I would just say, lastly, express appreciation when they do it, acknowledge it takes guts, and if they don't, keep asking. Be persistent and try and get it anyways and express that this is a part of your culture, a part of your values, and you want them to be a partner to you in trying to improve. So we're going to move on to getting a little bit more tactical. And this will get into to some of the more workshop-y parts or practicing parts of the session. And so just to start us off again with a little bit of a discussion and getting back and participating with your table, think about the feedback you shared or you heard or other feedback you've encountered at the beginning of the session. And just talk with the people at your table, like, why was that valuable? What made that feedback good for you? We'll just take a few minutes. And for people who missed the initial exercise, we just went around and shared the most valuable piece of feedback you had received, but you can touch on any other feedback that you've had, just talking about what makes feedback valuable. All right, let's wrap up. Could I get a couple of volunteers to share out some of what they heard at their table? Be brave. Go for it. We're gonna come back as a group for a moment now. Sorry. Thanks. If you could just maybe stand up, say your name, and share a little bit of what you heard.
Wait, am I saying mine?
Yeah.
Someone else. Okay. My name is Anthony. The feedback I was picking up was I got some 80,000 hours of career advising, and at the time I've always been like really interested in X risks, but X risks more generally, not like any particular risk like AI or biosecurity. So I was thinking of being like a jack of all trades and kind of like working on all of them at once. And she recommended that I pick one risk, specialize in it, becoming an expert in that risk, and then build my career around that. That was really helpful for me, just sort of like clarifying and sort of specifying my career plans and coming up with a plan that's probably going to be more effective.
Yeah. Thank you. And so I'm hearing, themes around clarity and also themes around like action orientation, perhaps, like actually and having this sort of outsized impacts. Does anybody else be willing to share some of what they said or heard in terms of why feedback can be impactful? Go for it.
Yeah, my name is Juan. Some of the feedback that I got recently that was pretty valuable related to a grant I requested from a grant maker that was later rejected. In the initial rejection, they don't like really send you out info by default probably, but then actually scheduling a call with the grant maker and be very explicit about the fact that I will take whatever feedback you give me. It's really valuable for me. I know sometimes you kind of need to like delegate with people, if you don't have that trusting relationship that maybe a manager has with their managing. That I wanted that, and then also like providing prompts, like what X characteristic, Y characteristic, if this is different, or that makes a difference. That's important, partly because it leads to making actionable plans afterwards. Like, given that like I still want to do something in the day, but this particular grant request is denied, I want very specific feedback about where I should be updating my direction based on. But that was really valuable advice, and I don't think it would have gone that if I hadn't like requested it explicitly or like in the conversation I had more like, just tell me whatever, instead of like actually thinking through like what are the possible things we can say, and then like move through that.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm hearing, again, actionability there, specificity, and also just courage, right? Like going and actually investing in some of that, asking for feedback and prompting people and lowering the bar for what they can share. Can we get maybe one more person? Oh.
I was struggling to think of something specific, but then something from when I was a lot younger came to mind, which I guess maybe means it was quite influential. I had to do like a work experience with at the end of high school, and basically towards the end of it, the guy was kind of essentially you should talk more, which kind of potentially awkward feedback to give, but I knew, having got to know him a bit, I knew that he was trying to say it, to help me out, so I took it positively, but I think it was quite influential because he made it clear that other people find it maybe quite awkward that I was like quiet and I was potentially making other people uncomfortable and like by being very reserved. And actually like it's probably helped like quite a lot to feel like more comfortable, like just not just like sitting there quietly worrying if I talk and like so it probably actually had like quite a big effect.
Awesome. Thank you for speaking up and sharing. And yeah, just to touch a couple of themes here. There again, actionability. It also seems like sharing some of the impact that your action or not speaking was having on some of the other people was something coming up there. And then also, if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe the relationship you had with that person was important for you in being able to have a sort of kind of trust or listening relationship there for that feedback. Thank you for sharing and listening there. We're going to get into some tactics here, but I thought that could help ground us. And then after we go through some of these tactics, we'll get a chance to do some practice. So first, we'll start on the giving side of things. For people who like mnemonics, here's one, coils. You can use it or not. The first thing I would do is make sure that you're in the right circumstances for this. And the easiest way to do this is ask for consent. Say, hey, I want to talk about X, or like, are you ready for our scheduled 2x2? Or make sure that they're in the right state of mind to hear it. And them saying they're not in the right state of mind doesn't necessarily mean they get to avoid feedback forever. You can follow it up with, when would be a good time for us to have this conversation. But if the intent of feedback is to drive action, making sure somebody is in the headspace to be willing to listen to this and engage with it in good faith, as opposed to immediately after a heated argument where tensions are still running high, can be a really important thing for setting yourself up for success before diving in. The next one is being objective to start. Sharing context, sharing facts, getting buy-in from the other person by being like, hey, this thing happened. And just starting off with something that allows people to have some common ground. Then there's that impact level that we were just talking about, explaining why it matters, naming what the effect of said behavior or said lack of behavior was, and then taking some time to actually listen. And this can come in a couple of different formats. You can ask questions for them. You can also just provide space for engagement. Some people just like to pause for a moment there and allow the other person to fill some of that space, to engage, to have them a chance to speak up. You aren't always going to have all of the context on why something happened. This is a chance for you to have a curiosity mindset. Take the same mindset you might have towards the analytical parts of your work and apply it to the other person. Be open-minded, be willing to change your mind. It also allows you to show that there's empathy, that there's a partnership here, that you are trying to engage with them and not just be like, hey, here's my perspective, it's right, we're going to move on. And then lastly, suggest. If you have recommendations or if you have an action plan that you want to talk about with them, it's oftentimes great if it is informed by the listening that you just did. Sometimes you want to go back and forth between these steps, ask for more context, do some of this listening, but then try and generate ideas on what could happen better. You aren't always going to be able to have those solutions, or you might not always know them coming into things, and sometimes there are other frames that can be helpful. So one that a manager did with me early on when we had a project that involved a lot of different stakeholders, and we knew things had fallen apart, but we didn't quite know why because there were so many different potential points of failure there. He framed it as an object to observe for me, where he was like, look, this went wrong. That seems objective. We can all agree with it, and this had this impact of our project not getting done on time. Do you know what happened here? You were owning this part of it. What happened? Do you have other information? And sometimes you may not come in with all of the solutions to problems when you want to give feedback or learn or try and fix things, and that's okay. You don't have to have them, and you can be upfront about that to try and build trust, as opposed to feeling like you need to have all of that. And I would just say, lastly, when in doubt, imperfect feedback is generally going to beat no feedback, and I think people err on the side of being too scared in most cases. That's not true of everybody, but for many of us, if you are, I'm not entirely sure here, try it. And then ask for feedback on your feedback if you need to later on. But getting it and building that muscle and building practice is oftentimes going to be a first step in getting things right down the road. I think that we oftentimes talk about giving feedback as a skill. The other skill I want to talk about here is receiving feedback, because I also think that this is a skill and something that is practiced, and something that we don't oftentimes give as much attention to, but is also important for setting up these sort of cultures of success here. A lot of this mirrors what's on the other side of things. So the first thing is do a self-check-in and make sure you're in the right headspace to be able to receive this feedback. And if you're not, it is okay. And you can ask people to come back to you later with their feedback. Make sure you're actually in a place to listen and absorb and make sure it's impactful. You want to also be an active listener when this is happening, and so feel free to first, part of it can just be bouncing back what you're hearing, particularly if things are complicated scenarios, and make sure that you have a mutual understanding. Oftentimes if there's an impact and you agree with it, just being like, yep, I realized it was a mistake, that was unfortunate, and asking questions. Not everybody's going to be great at giving feedback to begin with, and that's okay. So help them out on this journey and try and encourage them and appreciate the effort they're putting into helping you improve by asking them for more clarity. Solutions, again, there are a lot of different things you can do with feedback, and I want to be upfront that not all feedback is going to be high quality, and not all feedback should be acted upon. And so sometimes your solution is going to be to act upon somebody's recommendation. Sometimes it's going to be to act on something adjacent to their recommendation, but not quite. Sometimes people are better at identifying problems than there are solutions, and you're going to want to do something else. Sometimes the feedback isn't excellent, and you're not going to want to do it. And sometimes you aren't going to know, and you're going to want to pause, and you're going to want some time to think about it, and that's also okay. It is okay not to have all of the solutions all of the time when you're getting feedback, and you can circle back with somebody later on. The last thing is expressing thanks or gratitude. And again, this is just part of that both relationship building, but also culture building, part of the framework. Thank people when they give you feedback, particularly if they aren't the kind who have been doing it in the past. Express gratitude for it. And even when you aren't in agreement with everything that they said, you can thank them for the courage it took, for them for stepping up, and taking the time and investing in you and trying to help you get better. A few last tips before we start practicing is just sometimes feedback feels very scary. That's okay, it happens, particularly in some of these high stakes performance contexts. And so it's worth talking about what to do to sort of address those. And part of my advice here is a little bit of prevention goes a long way in helping these situations. And so spending time up front building in personal relationships and showing that you're a partner in them and you're giving them feedback for development purposes and that you've previously given them feedback and want to help them helps. One of the things that I did in one of my early work relationships that I think was probably the single most helpful thing I did for helping our performance, the performance of the person I was coaching, was going out to dinner with them and building more of a personal relationship with them and finding other ways of connecting with them and making me not the scary bus man. And doing things to connect with people and show that you are caring about them in a holistic sense can be a tool for them, making them more receptive down the road. Again, feedback rituals, I think, can help, and those systems can help because they force them to happen regularly until they build up and become the scary thing that you didn't address for a long period of time. Another tool in the toolkit is if there's tension in the relationship, sometimes feedback can feel tit for tat. You gave me criticism, so I'm going to criticize you back. And so a tool I've seen managers use in those situations is separating them into separate sessions and being like, hey, today I'm going to give you feedback. During our next session, you give me feedback, and we're just going to break those out so that they can't feel like they are pushing back against each other and retaliatory in nature. And then the last thing I'll say, and we'll then dive in, is practice. And just spend some time going through and role-playing. Find a partner, somebody you trust to help you out with these situations. And when it's particularly scary, you can even plan for multiple scenarios and reactions. And I remember one of the managers that I work with, she was going through a particularly tough situation, didn't know what the other person was going to say, didn't have full context, but knew something was terribly wrong and wanted to give feedback. And she just wrote up many pages. This was one of her first times also giving this kind of feedback. And she just wrote up a bunch of pages on a bunch of different possible responses the other person could give and planned for different scenarios and had a really successful time. And I also think it just gave her a lot more confidence going into things. Even beyond, I think she had a lot of the answers in her head, but it kind of de-stressed it and made it a little bit less scary because she knew she had thought through the scenarios. So I want to make sure we save some time for practicing. And so I'm going to give people a few moments to brainstorm, and then we're going to split up into to little pairs or triplets. But think of some feedback that you might want to give somebody or you've struggled with in the past and might want to redo over. Can be positive feedback, can be negative feedback. Choose something in your personal life if you want. The caution I would give with you is, again, we are going to do a little bit of role-playing practice here. So I know we're an EA community and many of us know each other. Please don't do anything that might be sensitive in nature here. But I'm going to give people a few moments to just brainstorm and take a moment to think about what you might want to practice with a partner. And then we'll have some time to go do that practice. Does that make sense to people? Okay, I want to make sure we have time for this. And so I hear conversations already. Keep going if you're already going into things, but if you haven't, we're going to have just a little bit under 10 minutes, I think, to be able to do some practicing. This is the second to last slide, so we're almost done with things, and I'll be hanging around afterwards if people want to talk to me or have questions later. Go and start doing some practice. Practice both being an active giver and an active receiver of feedback. You can give feedback on the feedback if you're somebody who is a third party listening to these. And I just put up some of the mnemonic steps up on the board as well for a little bit of a reminder there. Yes?
We don't know each other, so like we're probably not going to give meaningful feedback, or should we?
No, so sorry. This is you are not going to give. I would be shocked. It would be wonderful, but it would be a surprise if you gave feedback that was actually helpful to the other person. What I am trying to do here is practice some feedback that you want to give somebody else in your life. And the idea is it's mostly going to be helpful for the person who is trying to role play this through. But part of this is practicing that role playing skill and building that muscle of prepping for some tough feedback conversations by doing a little bit of practice in advance. Great. If people can come back one more time as a group. So thank you all. Hopefully you got in a little bit of good feedback and a little bit of good practice there. Just at the end, I wanted to give people a moment to reflect and see if there's anything you have learned or found helpful. And that can be things that you liked that I mentioned. It could also be things that you hated that I mentioned, and just do the opposite, in which case you also learned something. So hopefully there was some kind of learning of some sort that got on here. Maybe it was something that you just talked about in your groups with the others that you were practicing with. But if you have an action or an idea that you want to try out with other people, I would say just take one last moment, do a little bit of processing, go around your table, share with some of the people you were just talking with. And then we will call it. And I am also going to hang out here for a little bit because I don't think we have any other sessions that are here after this. So in lieu of a group Q&A, if people want to talk to me, you can feel free to come up with me later. Or you can follow up with me on Swapcard. Thank you all.